The soil probe came out of the ground at 6:47 in the morning, and what clung to the tip of it stopped Ruth Calloway's breath cold. Dark. Almost black. The kind of earth people in Harlan County, Kentucky had not seen on a hillside pasture in living memory. She stood there in the September frost with mud on her boots and the probe in her fist and the ridge behind her turning the color of a bruised plum in the early light, and she thought about a letter. A letter she had written to herself 5 years ago and folded into the front cover of a ledger she kept under the kitchen floorboard. She had not looked at it since the night she wrote it. But she knew every word. She pushed the probe back into the earth. Pulled it free again. The dark column held its shape. What she did with that soil sample over the next 18 months would change everything people in 2 counties believed about land that had been called worthless, exhausted, dead. But standing there in that field on the 17th of September, 2019, she did not know that yet. She only knew the smell. Dark and alive and faintly sweet, like something that had been sleeping for a very long time had finally decided to wake. Ruth Calloway had come back to the home place in the spring of 2014 driving a truck with 211,000 miles on it and a livestock trailer that listed slightly to the left. She had 12 Katahdin ewes, 2 Tamworth gilts, and a border collie named Persimmon who rode the whole way from Lexington with her head out the passenger window and her ears flat against her skull. Ruth was 41 years old. Her mother had died in February. The farm, 83 acres on a south-facing slope above Clover Fork, had passed to her by default, because her brother Dale had not wanted it and her father had been gone since 1998. The house needed a new roof on the back addition. The barn had a wall that leaned. 3 of the 6 pasture fields had been rented out to a neighboring cattle operation for 11 years, grazed continuously, never rested, never amended, and the ground in those fields had the color and texture of old concrete. You could drag a boot across it and raise a small cloud of gray dust even after rain. The fescue that remained stood in sparse clumps with bare mineral earth between them. Earthworms were nearly absent. When Ruth pushed a stick into the ground in the lower field, it stopped at 4 inches. 4 inches. 100 years ago this hillside had been old-growth forest. The topsoil would have run 18, 20 inches deep, dark and layered with centuries of leaf litter, root decay, fungal thread. 11 years of continuous cattle pressure had compacted that ground into something closer to pavement than pasture. The man who had rented it, Bobby Sizemore, told her at the gate the spring she arrived that she was welcome to have it back since there was nothing left in it anyway. He said it without embarrassment. Just a fact, delivered at a gate on a cold April morning. The county agricultural extension agent, a man named Gary Pratt who wore the same khaki shirt every time she saw him and drove a white pickup that smelled of fertilizer samples, came out in June of that first year at her request. She walked him through the 3 degraded fields and told him what she was planning. He listened with the particular kind of patience that precedes a thorough dismissal. Regenerative grazing, she said. Adaptive multi-paddock rotation. She would divide the damaged fields into smaller paddocks using temporary electric fencing. She would graze them intensively for a short period and then pull the animals off for 60, sometimes 90 days. She would let the plant roots drive deep before grazing again. She would never clip a plant below 3 inches. She would introduce Katahdin sheep specifically because their hooves, lighter than cattle, would cause less compaction. She would follow the sheep with the Tamworth pigs, rooting shallowly in areas she designated, breaking thatch. She would not till. She would not apply synthetic fertilizer. She would plant a diverse seed mix into the disturbed areas by hand. Gary Pratt looked at the gray ground and looked at her and said he had been with the extension office for 22 years and he had never seen a hill farm in this county recover from this level of degradation without a complete mechanical renovation. He told her the slope was wrong for the kind of moisture retention regenerative methods required. He told her the winters were too hard, the rainfall too irregular, the soil pH too acidic from the old coal wash runoff that had moved through the watershed in the 1980s. He told her, and this was the part she would remember exactly, word for word, the part she would write down in the letter that night, that she was a woman who had read too many books about farming in places that were not eastern Kentucky. She thanked him. She held the gate for him when he left. She stood at the gate for a while after his white truck disappeared around the first curve of the county road, and then she walked back to the worst field, the lower one where the stick had stopped at 4 inches, and she stood in the middle of it for a long time. The wind came through the gap in the ridge above her and bent the sparse fescue clumps and moved on. Nothing moved beneath her feet. No beetle, no worm, no sound at all from the soil. She went inside and wrote the letter. She did not tell her neighbor Earl Combs what she was planning, because Earl ran a conventional Angus operation across the creek and considered her father's old farm a sad case and considered Ruth herself, she suspected, a sadder one. But word moved through Harlan County the way it always had, along fence lines and at the co-op and at the counter of Dixon's Hardware on a Saturday morning, and by the end of that first summer she was aware that her project had a name among the people who discussed it. They called it Ruth's experiment, and the tone of those 2 words was the tone you use when you describe something that a child has constructed from cardboard, something you will not argue with because the arguing isn't worth the hurt it would cause. She divided the lower field into 11 paddocks. She used step-in posts and poly wire. Each paddock was roughly 1/3 of an acre. She moved the Katahdins through them on a schedule she tracked in a spiral notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, adjusting the rotation based on plant height, weather, and what she could see happening beneath the animals' feet. She kept her grazing events to 2 days per paddock in the first year, sometimes 1. Rest periods of 70 to 90 days. When a paddock was vacated she walked it, looking at the soil surface, at the plant stubble height, at the way the ground responded to pressure from her boot. The first year, very little happened. She had not expected otherwise. Compacted soil does not open in a season. The plant diversity stayed low. The ground remained pale where the cattle had been heaviest. She seeded a mix of red clover, chicory, plantain, orchard grass, and tall fescue into the disturbed areas after the pigs had worked them. Some of it germinated. Some washed downslope in the October rains. She noted everything in the spiral notebooks, which by the end of that first year numbered 3. She also sold enough lamb that fall to cover the electric fencing costs and half the seeding cost, which surprised her. The Katahdins were hair sheep, no shearing required, parasite-resistant, adapted to hill country. They gained weight on the patchy pasture better than she had projected. She sold 8 finished lambs to a restaurant in Harlan Town that had opened the year before and was buying locally. The check was for $1,847. She deposited it on a Tuesday and sat in the truck in the bank parking lot for a few minutes afterward, not smiling exactly, but something in her jaw relaxed. Earl Combs saw her moving paddocks one October morning and stopped his truck on the county road and called over the fence. He asked how many head she was running per acre. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said that was an awful lot of animal pressure for that ground. She said she knew that, and that the animals were off each paddock after 48 hours and the paddock would rest for 10 weeks. Earl chewed on that. He said his father had run cattle on his place continuously for 40 years and it had not hurt a thing. She did not argue that point. She told him she was trying something different because the ground was already in a different condition than his had been. He nodded, not convinced, and drove on. The second winter was the hard one. January of 2016 brought 3 ice storms in 11 days. A pipe burst in the barn. 2 of the Tamworth gilts got into the unharvested apple drops along the fence line and Founder threatened both of them, and Ruth spent 4 nights in the barn with a heat lamp and a veterinary text she had bought used from a farm auction in Katahdin. Both pigs were covered. She did not sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch from December 26 through February 3. But something else happened that second winter that she did not understand until spring. When the ground thawed, and she walked the lower paddocks, she found earthworms. Not many. 8, 10 to a shovelful of dirt in the area nearest the creek, where the moisture stayed longest. But they were there. They had come back, or the eggs had hatched, or whatever mechanism a worm uses to return to a place had been activated by something happening in the soil above them. She knelt in the mud of paddock 3 on the morning she found them, the 22nd of March, 2016, and held a worm in her palm and felt something that had been wound tight in her chest since April of 2014 release one small turn. She called no one. There was no one to call who would have understood. That spring she added a second observation to her notebooks. The plant diversity in the rested paddocks was expanding. She had not seeded all of them. But something was volunteering. Broadleaf plantain coming up along the old fence lines. Wild bergamot at the top of the slope where she'd never planted anything. Patches of crown vetch filling in the old poached areas near the gate. She photographed each paddock with a disposable camera and then later with an inexpensive digital camera she ordered from a catalog, and she numbered and dated each photograph and kept them in a binder beside the spiral notebooks. The county fair that summer, the Harlan County AG Fair, had a competition in the farm management category that she had entered once before and not placed. She entered again in 2016, submitting a notebook of her records and a short written description of her management approach. The judge that year was an agronomist from the University of Kentucky Extension Program. He read her entry and gave her third place, which carried a yellow ribbon and a check for $75. In his written comments he noted that her data collection was thorough and that her initial results were, and this was the word he used, intriguing, though he cautioned that the sample size was too small and the time period too short to draw conclusions. She kept the yellow ribbon on the nail above the kitchen sink. Third place meant someone had looked at what she was doing and not laughed. That mattered. Gary Pratt saw her at the fair and told her, not unkindly, that he had heard she was getting some clover established in the lower field. He seemed genuinely surprised. She thanked him for noticing. He said he still believed that without lime application she was fighting the soil pH problem with one hand tied. She said she was going to let the plant community shift the pH naturally over time through root activity and organic matter buildup, which was a process she had read about in research coming out of the Gabe Brown operation in North Dakota and from the Savory Institute. Gary Pratt's expression did not change, exactly, but something moved behind his eyes that might have been, from a certain angle, respect. By the third year, 2017, the changes were visible enough that Earl Combs crossed the creek one afternoon without calling ahead. Ruth was moving paddocks in the upper field and saw him pick his way across the log bridge she'd laid over the creek bank. He walked up to where she was rolling polywire and stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the pasture around him. The lower field, which 3 years ago had been gray and nearly bare, had an unbroken stand of mixed grasses and broadleaf plants that came to mid-calf. Dark-veined plantain leaves. The purple heads of wild bergamot going to seed. Orchard grass growing in thick fans. And throughout it, finer than anything she could have seeded deliberately, a low creeping mat of white clover that had arrived without her help and spread between the paddocks until it connected them. The ground, when you pressed it with a boot, gave slightly. Where the cattle had left it like concrete, it had become something yielding. Earl did not say anything about the field directly. He talked about the weather for a few minutes, about a boar his neighbor was selling, about the road condition on the county route above her gate. He was a man who could not quite bring himself to say the thing he meant, and she did not press him. When he left, he paused at the fence and looked back and said he supposed the clover had come from somewhere. She said it had. He said he might have to think about the lime situation on his east field, which had been giving him trouble. She said she thought that sounded like a good idea. She watched him cross back over the creek. The afternoon light was long and golden and it fell across the lower field in a way that made the grasses look lit from inside. She stood and watched it for a moment and then she went back to rolling polywire. The fourth year brought an unexpected event. A woman named Priscilla Holt, who wrote a farming column for a regional agricultural magazine published out of Berea, called Ruth in April of 2018 and asked if she could come out and see the place. Someone at the University of Kentucky had mentioned her name, apparently. Ruth said yes and told her to come on a Tuesday when she moved the animals. Priscilla Holt arrived in a small car with a notebook and a camera and walked the fields with Ruth for 4 hours without once checking her phone. She asked good questions. She knew what a soil aggregate was. She knew the difference between continuous and mob grazing. At the end of the day she sat at Ruth's kitchen table and drank coffee and asked Ruth why she had chosen to come back to this particular land instead of buying fresh ground somewhere more hospitable. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She said because this was the land that needed it. Priscilla Holt wrote her article and it ran in the June 2018 issue of Appalachian Farmer under the title Rebuilding What Was Lost. She described the farm in specific terms, the geology, the history of coal wash damage, the 11 years of continuous grazing. She described the changes Ruth had documented. She quoted the earthworm counts from Ruth's notebooks, which by 2018 showed an average of 22 worms per shovelful across the lower field, up from near zero in 2014. She quoted the plant species counts, which had risen from 11 identifiable species in 2014 to 37 in spring of 2018. She did not quote Gary Pratt. She did not need to. The article created a small stir. Ruth received 11 letters in July and August of 2018. Several were from other women farming hill country in eastern Kentucky and southwest Virginia who had been watching or reading or simply keeping their heads down on their own pieces of difficult ground. One letter was from a soil scientist at a research university in Morgantown who said he had been looking for a site exactly like hers to conduct carbon sequestration measurements and asked if she would consent to have her soil tested by his graduate students. His name was Dr. Marcus Teal. She wrote back the same evening. Marcus Teal came in October of 2018 with 2 graduate students named Alicia and Devon and a set of stainless soil probes and sampling bags and a small handheld device that measured soil respiration in the field. They spent 3 days. They cored the soil to a depth of 12 inches in a systematic grid across the 3 degraded fields and also sampled the 2 fields Ruth had never damaged, the ones she called the old fields, which had been in continuous mixed grass since the 1950s and served as her baseline. They measured bulk density, aggregate stability, penetration resistance, and collected samples for laboratory analysis of organic carbon concentration. Ruth watched them work from a respectful distance on the first day and then helped carry equipment on the second day, and by the third day she was moving through their grid system beside Devon, handing him bags, noting sample locations in her own notebook because she could not help but record things. Marcus Teal sat with her at the kitchen table the evening of the third day, after Alicia and Devon had driven back to the motel in Harlan Town. He had his preliminary field readings on a small laptop. He turned the screen to show her the penetration resistance data from the lower field. The numbers from 2018 showed the soil could now accept a probe to a depth of 9 inches before significant resistance, compared to the 4 inches she had recorded in 2014 with a stick. The aggregate stability measurements, meaning how well the soil clumped and held together when wet, were above average for this soil type. He told her the laboratory results would take 10 to 12 weeks. He told her not to read too much into the field data because the chemistry would tell a different story than the physical measurements alone. He was careful not to raise her expectations, and she respected him for that. He also told her, standing up and closing his laptop and looking out the kitchen window at the fields going dark in the October dusk, that in 20 years of soil work across the Appalachian coalfield region he had not seen a hillside pasture at this elevation and with this legacy of compaction and pH damage recover physical soil health to the degree these readings suggested. He paused. He said the chemistry would be the real test. Then he thanked her for the coffee and drove south toward Harlan Town, and Ruth washed the cups and listened to the October rain begin on the tin roof of the kitchen addition. January. February. She checked her mail every day without appearing to, meaning she made herself walk past the mailbox sometimes without opening it, which cost her something. She kept working. Moved her animals through their winter rotation on the drier fields. Fed hay in the mud of late February when the ground was too soft to graze without damage. Repaired a section of the old stone wall on the upper pasture that the frost had heaved. Ordered seed for spring. Kept her notebooks. March came and the letter from Morgantown came with it. On a Tuesday that was also the day she moved the Katahdins into the old upper field for their first spring grazing rotation. She did not open the letter immediately. She came inside and took off her barn coat and washed her hands and made coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and set the envelope in front of her. It had the university's letterhead in blue across the top. She opened it. Marcus Teal had written a cover letter explaining the findings. The laboratory data was attached in 2 pages of tables. She read the cover letter first. She read it again. Her hands did not tremble. Her face did not change expression. But she put the letter down and looked out the window at the fields for a long time, at the way the early March light lay across the pasture she had brought back from concrete to something living, and she breathed. The carbon numbers were preliminary, he wrote, and required a second-year sampling to establish a firm baseline rate of sequestration, but the current organic carbon concentration in the top 12 inches of the 3 restored fields averaged 4.1%. The undamaged old fields averaged 4.4%. The industry standard for a continuously grazed hill pasture in this region was 1.8 to 2.2%. The carbon content in her restored fields had more than doubled from the estimated baseline she and Marcus had reconstructed from the regional degradation literature. At this concentration, in 12 inches of soil across the total acreage of the 3 restored fields, which totaled 19 acres, the carbon storage was equivalent to approximately 4.6 tons of carbon per acre. 4.6 tons. Not yet the number that would change the conversation. But enough to understand that something real was in the ground. Something measurable that had not been there before she arrived. She read the tables. She read the cover letter one more time. She set it down and drank her coffee. It had gone cool while she sat there, and she drank it cool. She did not call Gary Pratt. She did not call Earl Combs. She sat with what she knew for a while, the way you sit with a thing that belongs to you before you let the world see it. That spring she expanded the paddock system into 2 more fields she had been resting since her arrival, one that had been used as a sacrifice lot by the previous renter, one that had been a hay field cut 4 times a year and never allowed to go to seed. She planted a new seed mix into both, a more diverse blend than the one she had used in 2014. Sainfoin this time, which she had read about in a Scottish Highland grazing study. Purple prairie clover. Hairy vetch as a nitrogen fixer. Mountain brome for its deep root structure. She also added 20 Katahdin ewes to her flock, bringing her total breeding females to 32. She sold 64 finished lambs that fall, at an average of $247 per head through a combination of the Harlan restaurant, a farmer's market she had started attending in Middlesbrough, and 3 direct sales to families who had heard about her operation through the magazine article. $16,008 from lamb alone, plus the 2 Tamworth sows she had bred and sold as breeder gilts at $380 each. Her feed costs, because her grazing system now provided the majority of her animals' nutrition from April through November, were low enough that the operation had crossed from marginal to genuinely viable sometime in late 2018. She did not announce this. She simply paid her property tax in full for the first time since she had inherited the place and bought a new soil probe, a real one, stainless, $60, with a calibrated depth scale, and kept working. Marcus Teal brought Alicia and Devon back in October of 2019. The second-year sampling. They covered the same grid, same depth, same protocol. Ruth helped carry equipment again, and this time she and Devon talked about the soil biology as they worked, because by now she had read enough to have a real conversation. He was a young man from eastern Ohio who had grown up on a grain farm and had come to soil science through a disillusionment with chemical inputs that he described carefully and without drama, which she appreciated. He told her about what he was seeing in the aggregate samples. The way the fungal hyphae were binding particles together. The presence of arthropod fragments indicating active invertebrate communities in the subsoil. Earthworm castings at depth, which meant worm populations were stable and moving vertically, not just existing in the top inch of organic matter. She listened to all of it. She stored it in the place where she stored things she needed to understand fully before she responded to them. The sampling took 3 days again. Marcus Teal stayed an extra half day, walking the lower field with her in the gray October light without speaking much, just walking and looking at the pasture that surrounded them. At one point he crouched and pulled up a fistful of grass and turned the root mass over in his hands. The roots on the orchard grass plants ran 6-7 inches into the soil, white and branching. He did not say anything. He held the roots for a moment and then pressed the plant gently back into the ground and stood up. The lab results came in January of 2020. Before they arrived, on the 17th of September of that same year, September 2019, the morning she had pulled the soil probe at 6:47 and stood in the frost with the dark column of earth in her hand, she had already sensed what was coming. The soil she could see and smell and feel had told her things the laboratory would later confirm in numbers. The darkness of it. The way it crumbled in a specific manner, not dusty and not sticky but something between, the way good bread crumbles. The smell of petrichor that came up even on dry days when you disturbed the surface, the smell of active biology, of geosmin released by Streptomyces bacteria in soil that is working and alive. That morning in September, with the ridge going plumb and gold behind her and the probe in her hand and Persimmon napping against the fence post at the paddock corner, Persimmon was 9 now, gray in the muzzle, still working but slower, preferring to herd from a distance. Ruth Calloway felt the particular feeling she had last felt on March 22, 2016, when she had held the worm in her palm. The feeling of something wound tight making one more turn toward loose. She pressed the probe back into the earth and left it standing in the ground and walked up to the house to make coffee. The January letter from Morgantown arrived on a Wednesday. February 5, 2020. She was in the barn sorting Katahdin ewes for a late January breeding check when she heard the mailbox flag clang, which it did in the right kind of wind, and she finished what she was doing before going to get the mail, because the ewes did not care what the mail contained and she had learned to respect that kind of priority. She brought the envelope to the kitchen and set it on the table and took off her barn coat and washed her hands again, the same ritual. Made coffee. Sat down. The cover letter was 4 paragraphs. Marcus Teal had written it carefully. She could feel the care in the sentence construction, the places where he had chosen words that were technically accurate and also human. He wrote that the second-year sampling confirmed a rate of soil organic carbon accumulation that he described as exceptional by any comparative standard for managed pasture systems in the region. He wrote that in the top 12 inches of the restored fields, the organic carbon concentration had risen from the 4.1% measured in 2018 to 5.3% in 2019. He wrote that when calculated across the full depth profile they had now sampled, and in this second year they had probed to 24 inches in a subset of locations, and when accounting for the bulk density corrections required for accurate carbon mass calculation, the total soil organic carbon in the 3 restored fields now stood at an estimated 8.2 tons of carbon per acre. 8.2 tons. She read the number 3 times. She looked out the window. The February fields were brown and gray, frost still lying in the shadow of the ridge. The lower field, the one that had stopped to stick at 4 inches. The one Gary Pratt had looked at and told her she had been reading too many books. That field was holding 8.2 tons of carbon per acre in its soil. More than the undamaged old fields, which measured 7.1 tons at full depth. More than any pasture site in the regional database Marcus Teal was drawing his comparisons from. She sat for a long time. Persimmon came and put her chin on Ruth's knee, because the dog understood silence the way working animals understand the things the people they belong to cannot say out loud. Ruth put her hand on Persimmon's head. There was something underneath all the numbers, something the letter could not hold. She thought about her mother, who had died in February of 2014 knowing the farm was going to pass to a daughter who had left for the city at 19 and come back at 41 with a borrowed livestock trailer and ideas from books about places that were not eastern Kentucky. Her mother had not said anything skeptical. Her mother had said, standing at the kitchen window the last winter she was alive, "The land will tell you what it needs if you know how to listen." Ruth had not been sure then that she knew how. She had not told her mother that. She had just stood beside her at the window and looked at the frozen fields. She thought about that now. She thought about whether her mother would have said, "The land has spoken," or whether she would have said something quieter, something that fit in a look rather than words. Probably the look. She also thought about the letter under the floorboard. She had not thought about it specifically in months, but now she knew what time it was. She pushed back from the kitchen table and crossed to the corner of the kitchen where the wide pine board lay, the one that had been loose since before she was born, and she pulled it up and reached into the cool dark space below and found the ledger and opened its front cover. The letter was there. Folded in thirds, the way she had folded it on the night of Gary Pratt's visit in June of 2014. The paper had yellowed slightly at the fold lines. The ink, ballpoint blue, had not faded. She unfolded it at the kitchen table. She had written, "Ruth, you are doing this because this land was alive once and can be alive again. You do not know how long it will take. You do not know if the people around you will understand before you have proof. What you do know is what is in the ground, or what is not in it yet, and you know what the ground needs. Keep the animals moving. Let the plants rest. Feed the soil first and the soil will feed everything else. When the proof comes, and it will come, remember that the proof was always there. In the earthworms. In the roots growing deeper every year. In the smell of the ground on a September morning. The numbers will only say in language other people can read what you have known with your hands since the second spring. Write down everything. Trust the land." She read it once. She folded it along the old fold lines and put it back in the front cover of the ledger and put the ledger back under the board. Then she picked up the phone and called Marcus Teal. He answered on the second ring and she thanked him for the letter and asked what the next steps were for his research. He said he would be submitting the data as part of a paper on adaptive multi-paddock grazing in Appalachian hill pasture systems, and he would like to name her farm and her location and her specific methodology in the paper, if she consented. She consented. He said he would also be presenting the findings at a regional soil health conference in Lexington in March, and asked if she would come and speak about her management practices. She was quiet for a moment. She said she would think about it. He said he hoped she would say yes, because the data was remarkable but the data did not breathe, and she did. He said that the way she had documented 5 years of management decisions in those spiral notebooks was the kind of practitioner record that soil scientists almost never had access to, and it made the research 3 times as valuable. She thanked him again and ended the call. She called Earl Combs next, which surprised her more than it would have surprised him. She told him she had received her soil test results from the university study. He said he'd heard she was working with a research team. Small county. She told him the carbon numbers. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him exhale. He said 8.2. She said yes. He said that was more than his best bottom ground. She said she knew. Another quiet. He said he'd like to come over and have a look at what she was doing when the ground dried out in spring. She said that would be fine. He said he'd bring coffee. She said she had coffee. He said he'd bring it anyway. She smiled at the phone after he hung up. The conversation she did not have, in February of 2020, was with Gary Pratt. She did not call him. She did not write him. She had no desire to stage a confrontation, no wish to walk him through the numbers for the satisfaction of watching his expression. That desire, she had expected to feel it someday and she found she did not. What she felt was closer to something that included him at a distance, the way you include in the history of a place all the forces that shaped it, including the ones that pushed against you. Gary Pratt had said she had read too many books about farming in places that were not eastern Kentucky. And she had read those books, yes. She had read the books and then she had come to this specific place and she had watched it specifically and she had made specific decisions based on specific conditions, and the books had been a door, not a destination. He had not understood the difference. That was not malice. That was the particular limitation of a man who had spent 22 years in one county telling people what worked, and who had confused familiarity with knowledge. She thought about this, and then she stopped thinking about it, because the ewes needed their afternoon feed check and Persimmon was standing at the barn door. The Lexington conference was in March. She drove the 180 miles in the truck with 211,000 miles on it, which now had 294,000 miles on it, still running. Persimmon did not come. Persimmon was 9 years old and the back and forth would have been too much for her joints, so she stayed with Earl Combs's wife, Janet, who had offered and who Persimmon had met enough times at the fence to accept as a temporary authority. Ruth stood at a podium in a conference room that held about 140 people, academics and extension agents and farmers, and she spoke for 30 minutes about what she had done. She did not use a presentation. She had a single photograph projected behind her, the lower field in September of 2019, taken from the ridge, the grasses thick and varied and dark green, the sky above the ridge clear and pale. She spoke from her spiral notebooks, reading specific numbers at specific dates, and then she spoke without notes. She talked about the earthworm she had found on March 22, 2016. She talked about what it had told her. She talked about the way soil biology communicates, slowly and in a language that requires years of attention to learn. She did not say she had proved anything. She said she had listened carefully and responded to what she heard and that the land had responded in kind. A woman in the second row, an extension agent from Letcher County, cried quietly during the part about the earthworms. Ruth noticed and kept her voice even. This was not a performance. This was a report. When she finished there were questions. A young man from the back row, a graduate student by the look of him, asked whether she thought the results were replicable across other hill farm sites in the region or whether there was something specific to her location that had enabled the recovery. It was a good question and a hard one, and she stood with it for a moment before answering. She said she did not know if every site would recover at the same rate. She said she knew that no site would recover without sustained, consistent, patient management. She said she had made mistakes every year, paddock timing errors, a seed mix in 2016 that was wrong for that field's moisture conditions, a decision in the winter of 2017 to allow a small amount of mechanical disturbance in the sacrifice lot that she believed had set back that field by 6 months. She said the mistakes were part of the record too, and that anyone who wanted to replicate her results would need to understand that the spiral notebooks contained failures alongside the recoveries. After the formal session, a group of maybe 20 people gathered around her in the hallway. Farmers mostly, some with mud still on their boots from morning chores, some with the particular quiet tiredness of people who had been up before dawn. She talked with them for 2 hours. She gave out her phone number on a folded piece of paper to anyone who asked. She drove home that night in the dark, arriving at the farm after 10, the truck headlights sweeping across the lower field as she came up the gravel lane. She stopped the truck and left the headlights on and got out and stood at the fence. In the white beam light, the winter field was brown and quiet. The frost had come back. She could see the stiff upright stalks of the dried bergamot and the low mat of dormant clover catching the light like pale wire. Beneath all of it, 12 inches down and deeper, the dark soil held what it had made. 8.2 tons of it per acre. Pulled down out of the air by plant roots and microbial chemistry and time, stored against the cold in the body of the earth itself. She thought about a word. Carbon. It was a cold, laboratory word for something she could smell on September mornings. But it was also just the element that living things were made of, stored back into the ground when you let the living things do what they were designed to do. She had not put it there. The plants had put it there. The fungi had put it there. The earthworms had mixed it deeper. The Katahdin sheep had clipped the grasses to the height that forced root turnover and root exudate release. The Tamworth pigs had broken the thatch crust that was blocking water penetration. The 90-day rest periods had let the mycorrhizal networks rebuild between disturbance events. She had orchestrated those things. But the land had done the work. She got back in the truck and drove up to the house. That was February of 2020, and then the world went sideways in March and she farmed alone for the better part of 2 years the way she had always farmed anyway, in the company of animals and weather and work, and the land did not know there was a pandemic any more than it had known about the coal wash runoff in the 1980s. The soil kept building. The ewes kept lambing. She kept her notebooks. The paper Marcus Teal published in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation in September of 2021 cited her farm specifically, Calloway Farm, Harlan County, Kentucky. 8-year restoration project. Adaptive multi-paddock rotational grazing with mixed species livestock, no synthetic inputs, no tillage. Soil organic carbon from estimated baseline of 1.9% to 5.3% in the top 12 inches. Full profile carbon at 8.2 tons per acre. Earthworm populations from near zero to stable, self-sustaining densities. Plant species diversity from 11 to 44 species. He submitted it alongside data from 3 other sites.